How Australian education was captured. From the 3 R's to social justice, the 60-year transformation. Picture a 1965 classroom, students in rows, teacher at blackboard, times tables, cursive writing, Banjo Patterson recited from memory. Australian history as achievement, Shakespeare and Dickens. Purpose crystal clear, transmit knowledge, build skills, form character. Yes, the cane hung on the wall. Yes, some teachers ruled by fear. Yes, kids with learning disabilities were labelled slow and forgotten. It wasn't perfect. 2025, students in pods. Teacher facilitates. Tablets glowing. History as multiple perspectives on colonisation's harms. Literature analysed through power relationships. Carbon footprints calculated. Gender as spectrum. Purpose fundamentally shifted. Shape values, form attitudes, create activists. Yes, corporal punishment is gone. Good riddance. Yes, learning differences get more support. Yes, technology offers tools. Some improvements happened. But something profound was lost, and something dangerous was gained. How did we get from teaching children to read, write, and calculate to programming them with a specific ideological worldview? How did objective knowledge give way to perspectives? How did national pride transform into national shame? How did academic rigour decline while ideological content exploded? This wasn't an accident. This wasn't natural evolution. This was deliberate, systematic capture of Australian education over 60 years. Here's the story, the ideas that drove it, the policies that embedded it, the people who orchestrated it, the timeline of takeover, what was lost, and what's coming next, because the capture isn't finished. Hate speech laws mandating perspectives, social media bans cutting kids off from alternative viewpoints. Part 1. The baseline. What education used to be. To understand what was lost and what wasn't worth keeping, we need honest assessment of what education used to be. The 1960s classroom wasn't paradise, but it had a fundamentally different purpose than today's classroom. Knowledge as foundation. English meant grammar taught systematically, spelling memorized, cursive required, Shakespeare and Dickens read for meaning and beauty. These weren't texts to be deconstructed through power and privilege, but works that elevated the mind and spirit. Poetry was memorized, not as rote busy work, but because these words were considered worth carrying in your mind forever. Mathematics meant times tables were automatic, mental arithmetic was daily, formal algorithms for everything, geometry proofs, regular testing. History was taught as narrative, a story with beginning, middle, and direction. Australian history began with Aboriginal peoples living on the continent for tens of thousands of years. Then European exploration, Cook's voyage, the first fleet, colonial establishment, gold rush, push for federation, achievement of nationhood in 1901, participation in 2 world wars, post-war migration boom. The story was largely one of progress and achievement, of a harsh land gradually tamed, of a nation built from almost nothing by ordinary people doing extraordinary things. Science was biology, chemistry, physics, taught separately with facts to learn and experiments to verify them. Geography meant knowing the world map, locating countries, understanding climate and resources. Civics meant how government actually works. 3 levels of government: how bills become law, what the Constitution says, how Westminster system functions. This wasn't about perspectives on democracy, but how the system actually operates. And yes, it came with patriotism. Students were taught to respect democratic institutions, honour the one flag, take pride in being Australian. Aboriginal culture was studied, but in a way that would not be recognisable today. Students graduated knowing things. They could calculate, write clearly, discuss history, locate countries, understand their government. They shared cultural literacy. They knew who Burke and Wills were, what Eureka meant, why Gallipoli mattered. They could place themselves in a continuing narrative. They understood Australia's British heritage and Westminster system. They felt connected to something larger than themselves, a nation with a story, with heroes, with achievements worth honouring. They had national identity, the classroom, teacher as authority, discipline maintained, and yes, corporal punishment, the cane, the strap, the ruler across knuckles. Gone now, but maybe we threw out discipline, boundaries, consequences, respect for elders, along with physical punishment. We threw out the entire framework instead of fixing the methods. What this system produced. The results were measurable. Australia ranked among top nations in international literacy and numeracy comparisons. Students who completed this system could read fluently, write clearly, calculate accurately, and possessed broad general knowledge. They shared common cultural literacy and pride in their country. Over the next 60 years, the entire thing was dismantled by ideas. Part 2. The Ideological Foundations. Ideas have consequences. The ideas that reshaped Australian education came from overseas. American and British universities, Marxist theorists in Latin America, Frankfurt School critical theorists, French postmodernists. These ideas entered Australian universities in the 1970s to 80s, captured education faculties almost completely, and spread into schools through teacher training. Let's trace the key thinkers and their influence. 1. Critical pedagogy, Paulo Freire and Marxist education. If you want to understand where progressive education comes from ideologically, start with Paulo Freire. This Brazilian educator published Pedagogy of the Oppressed in 1968, and it became the sacred text for critical pedagogy, essentially Marxist education theory. Freire's core argument, education is never neutral. It either liberates the oppressed or reinforces their oppression. Traditional education, where knowledgeable teachers transmit information to students, he dismissively called the banking model. The teacher deposits knowledge into students' empty minds like filling bank accounts. This, Freire argued, is inherently oppressive because it treats students as objects to be acted upon rather than active subjects. The alternative, he proposed, problem-posing education, where teachers and students engage in dialogue as equals. The teacher doesn't hold authority over knowledge. Instead, teacher and students together develop conscientization, critical consciousness about systems that oppress them. Education becomes not about learning multiplication tables or governmental structure, but about recognizing oppression and developing tools to resist it. Can you hear between the lines how this bloke might be relevant to things happening in Australia today? Notice what this does. It redefines what education is for. No longer transmitting knowledge, skills, and culture so students can function in existing society. Now it's making students critically aware of how existing society oppresses them so they can transform or overthrow it. The teacher isn't an authority who possesses needed knowledge, but a co-learner facilitating awakening to oppression. There's no objective body of knowledge to master. That's just the oppressor's perspective. This is Marxism applied to education. The oppressor/oppressed framework comes straight from Marxist class analysis. The rejection of neutral education comes from Marxist insistence that everything is political. The goal of consciousness raising leading to revolutionary transformation is classic Marxist practice. Now that's not to say that changing an oppressed/oppressor system is always bad, but we have to look at how that line of thought crept into Australian education and assess whether it works or not. Freire was joined by Dutch other critical pedagogues. Henry Giraud developed the concept of teachers as transformative intellectuals, not technicians delivering curriculum, but intellectuals who understand education's political nature and actively challenge dominant ideologies. Michael Appel brought Marxist analysis directly to curriculum itself, arguing that what counts as official knowledge in textbooks and testing is determined by power relationships, not by truth or value. Again, we shouldn't completely dismiss this idea just because we hear the word Marxist. A bunch of stuff in textbooks today is not at all truthful, just not through the lens of an oppressor writing the narrative. This is a whole line of investigation that needs its own playlist. Then we have bell hooks, written in lowercase as a political statement, who brought feminist and anti-racist dimensions, insisting that classrooms should be spaces where students transgress boundaries and challenge oppression. All of these people shared core assumptions. Knowledge is a tool of power rather than objective truth. Traditional education oppresses. Teachers should be activists, and schooling's purpose is social transformation, not cultural transmission. Australian education faculties absorbed these ideas completely in the 1970s to 80s. Teacher training was revolutionised. Instead of focusing on how to teach reading or explain fractions, courses focused on teaching for social justice, culturally responsive pedagogy, critical literacy. Future teachers read Freire, Giraud, Appel, Hooks, They were trained to see themselves not as authorities transmitting knowledge, but as facilitators, helping students develop critical consciousness. This wasn't happening at the margins. This became the mainstream. If you trained to be a teacher from the 1980s onward, you were trained in this ideology. 2. Multiculturalism and cultural relativism. The second stream came with official multiculturalism. When White Australia policy ended in 1973, immigration patterns changed dramatically. The question, how to integrate these newcomers? One answer, robust civic integration. Teaching all students about Australian democratic traditions, history and values, while celebrating cultural diversity immigrants bring. But with a strong expectation to assimilate. Is that not fair? These people made a rational decision, in most cases, to leave their homeland, their culture. But that's not what happened. Australia embraced official multiculturalism in 1978, and with it came cultural relativism, the idea that all cultures are equally valid, none can claim superiority. The key thinkers were Charles Taylor, a just society must actively recognise and affirm diverse cultural identities, and Will Kimlicka, multicultural citizenship emphasising group rights alongside individual rights. In Australia, Sneja Gunyu and Stephen Castles championed multicultural education, with Castles arguing that Australian identity itself was a construct used to privilege some groups over others. The practical effect in schools was that Australian history was reframed not as the nation-building story all students should understand, but as merely one cultural narrative among many. British heritage, Anglo-Celtic heritage, began to be systematically decentered. Anglo-Australian culture increasingly became criticised as the dominant culture imposed on others. The very idea of a shared Australian culture came under attack. This sounded inclusive, but it began to fragment national identity. Students graduated without a shared story of who we are as Australians. Instead, they had multiple competing stories defined primarily by ethnic background. Shared identity gave way to fragmented identities. This metastasized over time. For example, try and spot a student today who will dress up as Captain Cook on some primary school dress-up day. You might just be able to find a student dressing up as a bushman among a sea of saris and Asian-inspired cultural costumes. 3. Postmodernism, the philosophical destruction of truth. The third stream came from French postmodern philosophy, particularly Michel Foucault and Jacques Derrida. Foucault's key insight, or poison pill, knowledge and power are inseparable. What any society accepts as truth is just the perspective of those with power, enforced through institutions. Scientific knowledge, product of powerful universities and medical establishments. Historical narratives, written by victors. Moral standards, imposed by dominant class. Nothing is objectively true. Everything is perspective shaped by and serving power relationships. If knowledge is just power, then traditional curriculum is simply the powerful imposing their perspective on the powerless. Derrida's contribution was deconstruction, a method assuming texts always undermine themselves. That meaning is never stable, that every claim contains its opposite. We should read not to understand what authors meant or evaluate whether claims are true, but to uncover contradictions and expose assumptions. Every interpretation is provisional, meaning endlessly deferred. There's no final truth to discover. Interesting stuff, really. But how might it affect Australian education? These filtered into education through theorists who applied them directly to curriculum. The result, multiple perspectives as organising framework for everything. There's no single true account of history, only perspectives. No correct interpretation of literature, only competing readings. No objective scientific truth, only what the establishment currently accepts. This sounds intellectually sophisticated, students analysing multiple perspectives, but it destroys education's foundation. If there's no truth, only perspectives, what exactly are we educating students to know? If every perspective is equally valid, on what basis do we choose curriculum? If meaning is endlessly deferred, why bother reading at all? The postmodernist answers. We educate students to be aware of perspectives and power dynamics. We choose curriculum that challenges dominant perspectives and amplifies marginalized voices. We read to expose hidden assumptions and power structures. Education transformed from transmitting knowledge into deconstructing knowledge claims. From teaching what's true into teaching the truth is constructed. From building understanding into cultivating suspicion. No prizes for guessing what is now deemed suspicious and what agendas were able to dominate as a result. From the 60s onwards, the history of Aboriginal Australia was reframed by writers, downplaying truthful traditions of warfare as only skirmishes, multiple child brides as differences in culture, and many other things. Not all bad, but not truthful. Go read a picture book on Aboriginal culture in your child's school library. It ain't what it used to be. 4. Critical race theory and post-colonial studies. The fourth stream flowed from critical race theory and post-colonial theory. Derek Bell and Kimberlé Crenshaw developed critical race theory in American law schools, 1980s to 90s. Bell's concept of interest convergence. White people only support racial justice when it serves their interests. Racism is permanent in society, built into institutions. Crenshaw coined intersectionality. Race, gender, class intersect, creating unique oppression experiences that can't be understood by looking at any single category. This already exists in schools. Me and white supremacy appears on highly recommended high school book lists. In Victorian schools in 2025, teachers were instructed to log any racist comment in Compass and forward it to the Department of Education, effectively treating it as a code red incident. To what end is unclear. What is clear is that the data does not capture where much day-to-day racism actually occurs, often between Indian and African students. Yet it will almost certainly be used to conclude that racism in Victoria is widespread and requires further intervention. Post-colonial theory developed through scholars like Edward Said. Orientalism. Western knowledge about the East fundamentally distorted by colonial power. Gayatri Spivak. Can colonize peoples truly speak within Western systems? And Homi Bhabha. Homi Bhabha argued that colonial subjects often mimic the culture of their colonizers, but never perfectly, creating something new rather than simple imitation. This process produces hybridity, where identities and cultures are mixed, unstable, and can subtly undermine colonial authority rather than merely submit to it. In Australia, Aboriginal scholars applied these frameworks. Aileen Moreton-Robinson, Goanpool woman, applied post-colonial theory to Australian racism. Martin Nakata, Torres Strait Islander, developed cultural interface concept. Marsha Langton wrote extensively on Indigenous representation. And, in the view of one very hip Aboriginal Australian, Langton became more progressive and angrier over time. The effect on education. Complete reframing of Australian history through the exclusive lens of colonisation and its harms. Settlement and early immigration became invasion, while later immigration became multiculturalism and inclusive. Discovery rejected as Eurocentric. Pioneer hardship became theft and dispossession. Every achievement recontextualized as built on stolen land and colonial oppression. Is there truth in recognising colonisation harmed Aboriginal peoples? Absolutely. Should students learn about the actual violence that occurred from white people in those early days? Without question. Should they learn that there was a whole lot of violence from Aboriginal peoples as well? No, apparently, but this is well covered on upcoming courses on McClelland Academy, providing a largely forgotten memory of the story of Australia. The critical race/post-colonial framework insists racism and colonisation aren't historical events with ongoing effects, but permanent features defining everything. It creates pedagogy of guilt for white students and victimhood for Aboriginal students, and who knows what the Indian and other students are supposed to think about it all. For new immigrants, it will be everything that they know about Australia. 5. Gender theory, biology becomes social construction. Do you remember the 1990s push insisting that women wanted a snag, the sensitive New Age guy? What was that really about? In hindsight, it looks like an early attempt to reshape how men were told to be the right kind of man for women, a message that would later return in far more intense and prescriptive forms. Anywho, the fifth stream, gender theory and queer theory, particularly Judith Butler. Butler's Gender Trouble, 1990, argued that even biological sex, not just gender roles, is socially constructed. Male and female aren't natural categories, but productions maintained through compulsory heterosexuality and repeated performance of gendered behaviours. And guess what? It was all the man's fault. Gail Rubin pushed sexual liberation and abolition of traditional sexual morality. Eve Kosofsky-Sedgwick developed queer theory as destabilising all fixed sexual categories. Kevin Kumashiro applied queer theory to education. Schools must trouble traditional gender norms by teaching students that gender and sexuality are fluid. These ideas entered Australian education through Safe Schools Coalition and similar programs, but more fundamentally through reframing inclusive education, including LGBTIQ plus students morphed from preventing bullying into teaching all students that gender is spectrum, that gender identity might not match biological sex, and that questioning these categories is sophisticated while accepting them is a phobia and naive. The result has become that gender ideology is now taught to very young children. Not as a contested theory, but as established fact, students must accept to be considered inclusive. Teachers today find themselves lectured to in staff meetings, often by the employed Safe Space crew, not to refer to students as boys and girls or ladies and gentlemen. Let's not reinforce gender, please you dear educators of Australia. These programs really need their own video reviews. I will likely do them, but let me know in the comments if you actually want reviews on these programs to better understand them. 6. Climate activism, catastrophism as education. The sixth stream is environmental education transformed into climate activism. David Orr argued conventional education fails because it produces planet destroyers. Stephen Sterling developed sustainable education theory. Education itself must be transformed to serve sustainability. UNESCO's Education for Sustainable Development framework pushed this globally. The transformation from teaching environmental science to creating environmental activists. Students don't learn about climate as a complex system with uncertainties. They learn catastrophic climate change is certain, caused by humans, especially Western industrial civilization, and requires urgent action. The convergence into unified worldview. Okay, let's recap. Now notice how these 6 streams converge. From critical pedagogy, education is political, teachers are activists, purpose is transformation. From multiculturalism, Australian identity is fragmented, Anglo-Celtic heritage should be decentered, identity is group-based. From postmodernism, no objective truth, only perspectives and power. Traditional curriculum is oppression, and let's change the meaning of words. From critical race theory, everything is about race and colonisation, systems are racist, guilt and reparation required. From gender theory, biology is social construction, traditional categories are oppression, questioning is mandatory. From climate activism, catastrophe is imminent, Western civilization is cause, students must become activists. Core assumptions shared by all. Western civilization is fundamentally oppressive. Traditional knowledge is disguised power. Identity is group-based, oppressor/oppressed categories. Education's purpose is activist transformation. The goal is revolutionary change. This captured Australian education, not as separate policies, but as comprehensive, interconnected ideological ecosystem. Talk to any teacher who manages to stay teaching somehow, and if they're brave enough to tell you, you will get the picture to confirm all of the above. Part 3. The Contemporary Threats. Even as we examine 60 years of capture, new ideological battles are already emerging. 3 deserve close attention because they reveal how the pattern continues. Gaza/Israel. Which narrative will be mandated? The October 2023 Gaza war immediately raised questions for schools. Should it be taught, and if so, how and from whose perspective? While current curriculum trends might suggest a pro-Palestinian framing, the reality, especially post-Bondi, may swing the other way, with Palestinian suffering in Gaza minimised or ignored. A curriculum that presents only a pro-Israel narrative, just as one that presents only a pro-Palestinian narrative, would be educational malpractice. Curriculum is fluid, and victimhood frameworks can easily be repurposed to serve different agendas. What's at risk is a narrow, mandated perspective, or avoiding the topic altogether by declaring it too controversial. Parents should be asking how this is taught, what sources are used, whether students see both sides, and whether they are allowed to ask hard questions of all parties involved. Our elected leaders, under pressure, are already pushing for curriculum change. Hate speech laws, from protection to mandating perspectives. In late 2024 and early 2025, new hate speech laws, particularly around anti-Semitism, were introduced with the stated aim of protecting Jewish Australians from hatred and discrimination. The concern arises when such laws risk being interpreted so broadly that criticism of Israeli government policy is treated as hate speech, especially in schools. In that environment, teachers may avoid the topic altogether, discussions may be shut down, and curricula may drift toward presenting only one sanctioned perspective. Education should equip students to think through complex contested issues, not condition them to repeat approved positions. Students should be able to discuss Israeli policy, both critically and supportively, just as they can with any other government, without fear that political disagreement will be labelled hatred. The real question is whether these laws can protect students from genuine anti-Semitism while still allowing serious, balanced political discussion. There are warning signs to watch for: teachers refusing to touch the topic out of fear, curricula presenting Israel only positively, uneven discipline of student activists, or definitions of anti-Semitism so expansive they capture legitimate political criticism. A simple test is this: can a student say, "I disagree with Israeli government policy in Gaza," without being accused of hate speech? Can a teacher facilitate a balanced discussion without anxiety? Can the curriculum acknowledge both Jewish and Palestinian suffering? Hate speech laws mandate political perspectives or prohibit legitimate debate, meaning they cross into ideological enforcement. This problem deepens when students are told they may freely criticize some religions, but not others, creating confusion about equality before the law and inadvertently teaching selective moral rules. Faced with this complexity and personal legal risk, it's fair to ask why many teachers would choose to engage at all. Students also need to be able to bear witness to the ISIS-style level of hatred for everyone who is not Muslim, and they should understand what some imams are preaching. They should be able to discuss freely if such ideas are compatible with our culture. But how on God's green earth does a teacher facilitate that? Is it hate speech? How do you tell a young student that hate speech laws apply to Muslims, Sikhs, and Jews, but not to Christians and Catholics? How will that new one be implemented into the curriculum for youth to comprehend? Social media ban, protecting kids, or controlling information? In late 2024, Australia banned social media for under 16s, citing mental health, cyberbullying, and addiction concerns. These issues are real. Harmful content and attention-grabbing algorithms can negatively affect children. But the ban also restricts access to perspectives that challenge what schools teach. A 14-year-old can't easily explore alternative views on history, Gaza, climate change, gender ideology, or other hot topics outside the approved curriculum. Content that does appear must be actively searched for. It won't surface without specific intent. Meanwhile, students are in school every day receiving ideological lessons, assessed on demonstrating approved perspectives. The result is a generation whose primary exposure to ideas comes from curriculum and legacy media, with limited access to alternative viewpoints or citizen journalism. Social media isn't a perfect source of truth, but it is where dissenting opinions, critical debate, and alternative perspectives have managed, to survive and circulate. The origin story is telling. The ban began with a group of fathers worried their children were missing out on birthday invites, and instead of parental choice, lobbied for a blanket ban while investing their own money into the project. These parents are from 36 months, which I am looking into. Check out the social media ban playlist. The policy passed rapidly, and soon the government floated similar restrictions for adults, and there are imminent talks about banning X. We all need to be protected from harmful stuff, treated as if we are children. Big government knows best. The effect is a society where young people are protected from harm and from information that challenges the narratives they are taught. Questions remain. Can students access educational content presenting different perspectives? The real test is whether students are protected and still able to encounter diverse perspectives, or simply protected from ideas their schools don't endorse. You might think young people just watch the same mindless content adults do. but they inevitably encounter alternative views. There are countless pathways in. Take Mr. Beast, watched by almost every Australian child at some point. He appears on Joe Rogan, a student watches a clip out of curiosity. Rogan interviews a rapper or a scientist, and suddenly there are ripples through the matrix. That's how ideas actually spread these days. The removal of access to information is nothing new. And what are youth of today learning about the fact that hate speech laws exist? They are learning they can't say things. Some groups are protected, others are not. The pattern: multiple mechanisms of ideological control. Curriculum pushes approved perspectives, hate speech laws limit what can be questioned, and social media bans cut off alternative viewpoints. The result: students get information from a narrow set of sources, schools, textbooks, legacy media, while missing out on broader debate and dissent online. It's information control. It's unlikely any single teacher intends this, but the combination creates a generation more captive to institutional narratives than any before. Parents need to be aware and help children access diverse perspectives and develop genuine critical thinking. For guidance, see the Parents' Toolkit for practical solutions. Part 4. The Policy Timeline. Ideas need policy to become mandates. Let's trace how progressive ideology was systematically embedded into official requirements. 1980s. Establishing foundations. The 1980s were when multiculturalism and Aboriginal education shifted from fringe concerns to official national priorities. 1983. Blackburn Review. Education of Aboriginal Australians. Recommended Aboriginal content be integrated across all subjects. All teachers trained in Aboriginal culture. Aboriginal people involved in curriculum development. At the time seemed reasonable. Why shouldn't students learn about Aboriginal culture? The problem wasn't the premise, but the trajectory. What started as include Aboriginal perspectives became Aboriginal perspectives must be embedded everywhere, at every level. Became Aboriginal perspectives are central to understanding everything Australian. Became failure to centre. Aboriginal perspectives is evidence of ongoing colonisation. 1987. National Policy on Languages. Pushed bilingualism and community language maintenance. Superficially reasonable, students should learn languages, but embedded assumption, Anglo-Australian linguistic dominance is a problem to solve. English shouldn't be privileged as Australia's common language, maintaining separate linguistic identities more important than building common communication. 1988. Aboriginal Education Policy. Made Aboriginal education national priority, committed to Aboriginal studies as part of all curricula. The goal of ensuring Aboriginal students access quality education was wholly justified. The goal of Aboriginal studies across all curricula was the thin edge of a very large wedge. 1989, Hobart Declaration. State and federal education ministers agreed on national goals including appreciation of and respect for cultural diversity and understanding of Australia's role in the Asian region. These declarations sound benign, but they're encoding multiculturalism and regional identity over national identity as official priorities. Once in national goals, they flow downward into every curriculum, school and classroom. 1990s. Competencies over knowledge. The 1990s saw fundamental shift from knowledge to competencies, from what you know to what you can allegedly do, from content to process. 1994. Working Nation introduced competency-based training. Instead of students should know Australian history, we got students should demonstrate competencies in historical thinking. Sounds technical and boring. It's not. When education is about knowledge, you must decide which knowledge matters, raising questions about cultural value. When it's about competencies, you dodge that question, except you can't think critically about nothing. Critical thinking requires knowledge to think critically about. But competency-based education obscured this. This was also when curriculum started a long march from factual knowledge toward learning how to learn. 1995. National Review strengthened Aboriginal perspectives across curriculum. Not just Aboriginal studies as separate subject, Aboriginal perspectives in every subject somehow. 1999. Adelaide Declaration updated national goals to include respect for social, cultural, linguistic and religious diversity. Notice proliferation of diversity categories and commitment to pursuing knowledge and understanding. Not possessing knowledge. Each shift looked minor in isolation. Cumulatively, they dismantled education's foundation. 21st century cross-curriculum priorities emerge. The 2000s were when ideological content that had been bubbling under the surface broke through explicitly. Australia decided Aboriginal perspectives, sustainability, and Asia engagement weren't just worthy topics to include somewhere, but priorities embedded across every subject. Australian schools began flying the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander flags gradually after 1995, when both were officially recognised as flags of Australia. From the late 1990s onward, state education departments increasingly encouraged schools to display them alongside the Australian flag, and by the 2000s to 2010s, the practice had become common in many public schools. Meanwhile, more and more Australian land became native title, but students never hear about the people behind the legal battles. Pro bono Zionist lawyers with loyalty to a land far away. Instead, the lesson is all about returning land to its original inhabitants. You thought it was just woke left-wing activists pulling all the punches of that whole saga? Think again. 2002 Review. Critical recommendation. Aboriginal perspectives must be embedded in all learning areas, not taught in separate Aboriginal studies units. Mathematics teachers, science teachers, arts teachers, everyone needed to find ways incorporating Aboriginal perspectives. How do you teach Aboriginal perspectives in mathematics? Well, you'll figure something out, because it's mandatory. This happened under the Liberal National Coalition. 2007, AITSL established. You probably thought this was old. The Australian Institute for Teaching and School Leadership set national teacher standards. Required. All teachers must demonstrate knowledge and understanding of impact of culture, cultural identity, and linguistic background on education of students from Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander backgrounds, and must design and implement learning activities developing cross-curriculum priorities. Translation. Every teacher, regardless of subject, must be trained in Aboriginal education and must teach ideological priorities that would soon be mandated. This wasn't optional professional development. This was mandatory for teacher registration. Want to teach in Australia? You will be trained in this ideology. You will teach this ideology, or you won't be registered. 2008 Melbourne Declaration. The critical moment. This is where the three cross-curriculum priorities were formally born. 1. Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander histories and cultures. 2. Asia and Australia's engagement with Asia. Don't forget Daniel Andrews signed Victoria Up to the Belt and Road initiative soon after. 3. Sustainability, not suggestions, not options. Declared priorities that must be embedded across all subjects at all levels. Every learning area must address them. Every student must engage with them. Every teacher must teach them. And notice what they are. Aboriginal perspectives, post-colonial guilt, Asia engagement, decentering Western identity and connection to Western countries, sustainability, climate activism. This is comprehensive ideological revision of what students should know, value, and believe. The Declaration also introduced general capabilities, literacy, numeracy, ICT, critical and creative thinking, personal and social capability, ethical understanding, intercultural understanding. Sound reasonable until you examine what they mean in practice. Critical thinking means progressive version, identifying bias in traditional narratives, not in progressive ones. Ethical understanding means curriculum's ethical frameworks. Intercultural understanding means cultural relativism. The Debunking Curriculum series, separate playlist, delves deep into all of this. I'm working through all the states. Victoria's new curriculum will be the first big box to tick. 2009, ACARA commissioned. Rudd Labor government commissioned Australian Curriculum Assessment and Reporting Authority to develop Australia's first national curriculum, presented as coordination and consistency. Wouldn't it be better if all Australian students learned the same things? But also centralisation of control. Instead of states having autonomy, there would now be one national curriculum developed by one body. And that body would embed the three cross-curriculum priorities and general capabilities into every subject. While it was released by the then Labor government, specifically by Julia Gillard, A known Fabian, the groundwork was done by the Liberal National Coalition. 2010s, implementation and gender wars. If the 2000s were when ideological priorities were declared, the 2010s were when they were systematically embedded through the Australian curriculum. 2010 to 2015, Australian curriculum rollout. Progressive implementation with English and mathematics first, then history, science, geography, eventually all subjects. Every single one required to address 3 cross-curriculum priorities. ACARA published elaborate guidance on embedding these priorities, because apparently teachers needed help figuring out how Aboriginal perspectives related to chemical equations. The result is sometimes absurd. Math problems about Aboriginal bush tucker, science units about Aboriginal scientific methods which were made up recently, history spending more time on dispossession than achievements, geography organised entirely around sustainability, English literature choices driven by diversity needs rather than literary merit. Absurdity wasn't a bug, it was a feature. The point wasn't that Aboriginal perspectives naturally connected to every subject. The point was they had to be included everywhere, so students understood Aboriginal perspectives were central to everything. Awkwardness of fit didn't matter. What mattered was students getting the message. Everything you learn must be understood through a lens of Aboriginal dispossession, cultural diversity, environmental crisis. Some groups are perpetual victims. 2013. Gonski reforms. Tied increased federal funding to schools achieving equity outcomes and implementing approved programs. Schools needed money. The government had money, kind of. Money came with strings. You'll implement these programs, address these priorities, achieve these outcomes. Schools wanting funding complied, which was all schools. 2014 to 2016, Safe Schools Coalition, program about preventing bullying of LGBTIQ+ students. Who's pro-bullying? But actual materials taught gender ideology to children. Gender is spectrum. Students might be born in wrong body. Questioning gender identity is normal and should be encouraged. Materials sexually explicit and age inappropriate. Parent groups objected. Media covered. Politicians denounced. Federal funding pulled. But ideas didn't disappear. They were simply repackaged into respectful relationships curricula that is taught today. Inclusive education frameworks, general diversity and inclusion programs, continuing on the same content without the controversial Safe Schools label parents could rally against. The public battle was lost. The war was won. Gender ideology now embedded across health and physical education curricula nationwide, just without the catchy program name. 2020s, Victorian Curriculum 2.0 and maximum saturation. If the Australian curriculum seemed ideologically saturated, Victoria said, "Hold my soy latte," and produced Victorian Curriculum 2.0. It was developed from 2020 to 2023 during and after COVID lockdowns, when parents were distracted, when normal consultation processes were disrupted, when scrutiny was minimal. First implemented in 2023 with little fanfare and even less public debate, it is now a fully developed and rolled out curriculum for 2026. Parents weren't asked. Alternative views weren't considered. The education establishment simply decided this is what Victorian students would learn. VC 2.0 represents a culmination of 40 years of ideological capture. Everything we've traced, critical pedagogy, postmodernism, critical race theory, gender ideology, climate activism, it's all in there, explicit and unapologetic, not creeping incrementalism. Comprehensive ideological saturation presented as simply updating curriculum for modern Victoria. If you're a Victorian parent, I highly encourage you to watch the Victorian Curriculum 2.0 playlist. Meanwhile, other states produced similar updates. New South Wales enhanced Aboriginal perspectives and sustainability. Queensland strengthened cross-curriculum priorities. Western Australia embedded similar frameworks. Pattern consistent nationwide, more Aboriginal content, more sustainability, more diversity and inclusion, more critical thinking, their version, less knowledge, less cultural transmission, less national identity. The ratchet pattern, only one direction. Policy changes always moved one way. More Aboriginal content, more sustainability, more diversity, more progressive ideology, more blame and victimhood, never less. When Labour was in power, ideology accelerated. When the coalition held power, it continued at the same pace. It never reversed. Liberal or Conservative governments didn't roll back the Melbourne Declaration, cross-curriculum priorities, or Aboriginal perspectives mandates. By the time Conservatives governed, institutions were already captured. Bureaucrats writing curriculum were true believers, teacher unions ideologically committed, and education faculties fully on board. Politicians could call for back to basics, but the people actually implementing policy were unmoved. Teachers are just trying to survive. One said, "I've got enough to deal with," while 11-year-old Johnny with a baseball bat smashes the windows. Taking on the curriculum battle is a luxury no one has. This is institutional capture. You don't need continuous government control. Just control the institutions that implement policy. By the 2010s, progressive ideology dominated these institutions completely. Part 5. Who drove the capture? Let's name the institutions and groups that drove this transformation. Universities, the starting point. Education faculties systematically hired progressive professors from 1970s onward. Traditional educators were marginalised or not replaced when they retired. By 1990s, they were thoroughly captured. Want to become a teacher? You'll spend your degree reading Marxist-inspired research papers, learning about systemic oppression, discussing embedding Aboriginal perspectives across curriculum, being trained to see yourself as the agent of social change. Units and single sessions called Education for Social Justice, Critical Pedagogy, Culturally Responsive Teaching, Transformative Practice. Will you learn how to teach reading through systematic phonics? Yes, that's still in there. Or is it? Not sure yet. Wait for the Unpacking Universities series. How to teach long division effectively? Not really a priority. How to maintain classroom discipline? That's oppressive, teacher-centred thinking. Leading universities: Melbourne, Graduate School of Education; Monash, Sydney, Australian Catholic University. Catholic, in name only for education faculty. Fully progressive, Deakin. These trained the teachers, produced the researchers who wrote the studies, consultants who advised curriculum authorities, professors who trained next generation of teacher trainers. They became a self-reinforcing, captured system, and they accredited each other. AITSL, which accredits teacher education programs, staffed by people from the same institutions. Ideology both produced and validated by the same captured network. Not all the professors, researchers, fellows, teachers and principals played along, of course. Hence why you can watch years of the Classical Liberal Education Conference for free over at McClelland Academy. Bureaucracy embedding it. ACARA, developed Australian curriculum with priorities embedded, staffed by people trained in captured education faculties, committed to progressive ideology, seeing their role as implementing best practice, as defined by their graduate schools. Good people stayed and fought, but they are largely gone now, fighting in different ways. AITSL, set teacher standards, requiring ideological competencies. Think of this as an enforcement arm ensuring no one teaches without ideological training. Every registered teacher must meet standards requiring Aboriginal education competency, inclusive practice, culturally responsive teaching. State authorities: VCAA, NESA, QCAA, SCSA. These operate independently in structure, identically in ideology. They hire from same captured faculties, believe the same orthodoxies, and produce curricula differing in details, but not ideological framework. Teachers' unions, political muscle. Australian Education Union, 190,000 members, consistently progressive on every education issue. The AEU have supported every progressive curriculum reform, advocated for Aboriginal perspectives across curriculum, promoted climate change education and activism, defended safe schools vigorously when parents objected. The AEU pushes diversity and inclusion policies, opposes standardised testing as inequitable, teacher accountability as unfair, traditional academic standards as regressive. Why? Partly because unions lean left generally, but also because many teachers genuinely believe in progressive education. They were trained in it, think it's what good teaching means. When union advocates for these positions, It's representing what many members sincerely believe. But union also provides political muscle individual teachers/parents lack. Can organise protests, lobby politicians, fund campaigns, mobilise voters. When governments attempted modest pushback, trying to remove safe schools or increase testing, AEU fought hard. Politicians care because unions deliver votes. Of course, if you're currently a teacher, there's a new one out there that might float your boat. It's called the Red Union. Not red as in communism, red as in the Australian flag ensign. They're pretty different. Check them out. Activist organisations providing content and training. A network of NGOs provided curriculum materials, teacher training and advocacy. Safe schools provided gender ideology materials/training. Federal funding pulled after controversy, but ideas rebranded into respectful relationships and inclusive education. Reconciliation Australia promotes reconciliation, action plans in schools, resources for Aboriginal perspectives, teacher training. Framework Australia defined by dispossession, whites owe perpetual debt. Aboriginal perspectives must centre everything. Australians Together, a Christian-led group of people, had a massive prep to Year 10 curriculum resource package ready to go to support the Aboriginal cross-curricular agenda. I covered this a while back. It's quite alarming. Cool Australia provides free sustainability and climate resources. Free because funders want this content in schools. Materials present activism, not balanced science education. Sustainability Victoria and similar state bodies. Government-funded organisations providing activist resources. Various LGBTIQ+ advocacy groups. Resources for inclusive education teaching gender spectrum ideology, often to very young students. These organisations were welcomed or newly established because they help teachers meet curriculum requirements around Aboriginal perspectives, sustainability and diversity. Need Aboriginal perspectives in mathematics? Here are ready-made lesson plans. Need sustainability in science? Here's a complete unit. Teachers use them, perhaps without questioning balance, because it saves time and ticks boxes. Media, cheerleading the revolution. The Age, Sydney Morning Herald, The Guardian Australia, ABC consistently supported progressive reforms and attacked critics. Safe schools? Media defended it vigorously and portrayed opponents as homophobic. Aboriginal perspectives? Praised as overdue, critics called racist. Climate in curriculum? Celebrated student activism, critics dismissed as deniers. Concerns about declining standards? Dismissed as nostalgia for outdated rote learning. On the right? If you have concerns about new restricted speech, you're an anti-Semite. All labels, all aimed to quash dissent. Left-wing and some right-wing legacy media created an environment where progressive education was enlightened. Opposition was bigoted, made organised resistance extremely difficult. What parent wants to be called racist for objecting to curriculum? What teacher wants to be labelled homophobic for questioning gender ideology? You're out on the curb for that one. Lack of media skepticism meant progressive capture proceeded with minimal scrutiny. So policies were implemented, curriculums were rewritten, schools were transformed with mostly positive or neutral coverage. By the time concerns became widespread, the capture was complete. Parents, asleep until recently. For most of 40-year capture period, parents weren't paying close attention to curriculum documents. They rightly trusted schools and teachers to provide good education and assumed education was basically the same as when they attended. They rightly had little awareness of the ideological shift and due to the pressures of raising a family, lacked time and expertise to scrutinise what was being taught. They rightly believed education professionals knew best. By the time parents started noticing, when children came home saying Australia's founding was racist, that gender is spectrum, that they should be activists for climate justice, that families' values were stereotypes, the capture was nearly complete. Institutions, curriculums, teachers, captured. Reversing this would require organised, sustained action against powerful institutional resistance. Now parent awareness is growing. The COVID era helped a lot as parents could listen into lessons. But this awakening came late, perhaps too late to reclaim the system. The question is whether parents can reverse this capture or need to build alternatives outside the captured system. Again, I recommend to go and watch the Parent Toolkit video. Part 6. Complete Timeline. Let's see the complete timeline, in short, showing the acceleration pattern. 1960s, traditional baseline, knowledge-focused, teacher-directed, academically rigorous, high international rankings, cultural literacy, national pride. Problems: corporal punishment, learning disabilities ignored. Status: traditional education dominant. 1970s, first incursions. Frere's critical pedagogy enters universities. White Australia policy ends 1973. Official multiculturalism 1978. Progressive methods begin. Core curriculum still traditional. Status: pedagogical changes begin, content remains, mostly traditional. 1980s, laying foundations. Blackburn Review 1983. National Policy on Languages 1987. Aboriginal Education Policy 1988. Hobart Declaration 1989. Postmodernism enters universities. Aboriginal content begins across subjects. Status: ideological foundations established in policy and teacher training. 1990s, knowledge to competencies. Working Nation 1994. Adelaide Declaration 1999. Post-colonial theory influences curriculum. Shift from content to process. Status: education's purpose fundamentally shifted. The first decade of the 21st century, cross-curriculum priorities. Aboriginal Perspectives Review 2002. AITSL 2007. Melbourne Declaration 2008. The Critical Moment with 3 priorities, mandatory everywhere. ACARA, commissioned 2009. Status: ideological content comprehensively mandatory across all subjects. 2010s, implementation and gender. Australian curriculum rolled out 2010 to 2015. Gonski 2013. Safe Schools 2014 to 2016. Controversial, but ideas survived, rebranded. Status: complete ideological saturation at national level. 2020s, maximum intensity. Victorian Curriculum 2.0, 2023. Similar updates nationwide emerged or are emerging. Emerging battles over Gaza/Israel, hate speech laws, social media bans. Status: complete capture, mission accomplished, new battles emerging. The acceleration pattern, 1960s to 1980s. 20 years for ideas to enter universities and establish foundations. 1980s to 2000s. 20 years for foundations to become official policy. 2000s to 2010s. 10 years for policy to become mandatory everywhere. 2010s to 2020s. 10 years from mandatory to absolutely saturated. Each phase faster than previous. Each building on what came before. Each harder to reverse. By 2023, every subject, every level, every school, complete. A video outlining this long march by showing the changes in picture books over this period might be an interesting thread to follow. It will certainly be a lot easier for me than analysing textbooks. Part 7. What was lost and what was gained? Let's be honest and assess both sides, because something was gained, but a great deal was also lost. Here are 10 major losses in modern education. First, knowledge transmission. Education once gave students a shared body of knowledge, cultural literacy, and a common foundation. Today, students are told to construct their own meaning, which sounds empowering, but results in fragmented perspectives, no shared reference points, and a society that struggles to communicate with itself. Second, academic rigour. We once expected mastery. Standards were clear. Assessment meant something. Now we emphasise growth mindset. Avoid failure at all costs. Inflate grades until assessment itself becomes meaningless. Third, cultural transmission. Schools once passed on a shared Australian story and sense of national cohesion. Now students are taught competing narratives based on ethnicity or identity, with no common story to bind the nation together. Fourth, objective truth. Education used to assume truth exists and can be approached through evidence and reason. Today we hear your truth and multiple perspectives so often that rational debate becomes almost impossible. Fifth, moral clarity. Right and wrong were once taught explicitly alongside character, virtue, and personal responsibility. Now we have values clarification, non-judgmentalism, and systemic explanations that quietly remove responsibility from the individual. Sixth, teacher authority. Teachers were once respected experts who maintained order and authority. Now they're framed as facilitators or co-learners, with student voice equal to teacher voice, often producing chaos rather than empowerment. Seventh, preparation for real life. Schools used to prepare students for adult responsibilities and resilience. Today, safe spaces and protection from discomfort leave many students unprepared for the demands of work and life. Eighth, national pride. Achievements were once celebrated and heroes honoured. Now failures are foregrounded. Historical figures are problematized, and students are taught to feel guilt rather than pride about being Australian. Ninth, parental authority. Parents were once recognised as primary educators, with schools supporting family values. Increasingly, schools contradict those values, undermining parental authority and creating conflict at home. And 10th, educational excellence. Australia once ranked near the top internationally. Today, PISA scores decline. Minimum standards aren't met, and employers report graduates who are simply unprepared. That's what was lost. And once you see it laid out like this, the question becomes unavoidable. Was what we gained worth the cost? Entrepreneurial skills were largely absent throughout this period. That's interestingly still largely the case today. What was genuinely gained? Let's be fair. 1. Corporal punishment ended. Unambiguously good, we should celebrate this. 2. Better support for learning differences. Genuine progress for students with dyslexia and other learning issues, though this is very costly. 3. More engaging pedagogy sometimes. When done well without ideological overlay, some innovations work. 4. Environmental awareness. Some legitimate environmental education valuable. Problem was transforming to activism. 5. Reduced bullying efforts. Good goal. Problem was when inclusion became enforcing specific ideologies. 6. Technology integration can be valuable when supplementing rather than replacing knowledge. The balance. We could have kept knowledge transmission, academic rigour, and cultural coherence while eliminating corporal punishment, supporting learning differences better, including more complete history, and adopting best pedagogical innovations. That would have been reform. Instead, we got revolution, and revolution destroys more than it builds. Part 8. Could it have been stopped? Could this capture have been prevented? Yes, but it required awareness, organisation, political will, and understanding of the stakes that simply didn't exist. Critical missed moments. 1970s to 80s. University capture could have been stopped if universities insisted on ideological diversity in hiring, accreditation demanded balance, and government funding was conditional. But academic freedom was invoked, traditional professors quietly exited, and hardly anyone was watching. Lesson. Institutional capture begins in hiring and curriculum committees, long before effects are visible. 1990s to 2000s. Policy embedding could have been stopped if ministers, states, unions or parents objected. But there was bipartisan support, states wanted funding, and include Aboriginal perspectives sounded reasonable. Lesson. Policy capture happens through seemingly reasonable documents with mandates hidden in the fine print. 2010s. National curriculum. Could have been stopped if governments rejected ideological curricula, states refused adoption, parents mobilised, teachers resisted, or legal challenges were mounted. But political will was absent, teachers largely believed in it, and alternative structures were missing. Lesson. Once curricula are adopted, reversing them requires rebuilding institutions, not just political power. 2020s. Victorian Curriculum 2.0. Could have been stopped if parents organised, media scrutinised, politicians demanded consultation, or mass protests occurred. But COVID distracted everyone, media coverage was minimal, and political attention was elsewhere. Lesson. Crises provide cover for controversial policies, allowing implementation with minimal scrutiny. One positive. Many parents woke up by listening into lessons during COVID and asked, "What the actual feck are you teaching my child?" The choice facing parents. Parents now face an important choice. Option 1. Fight for reversal. Organise collectively. Lobby politicians. Demand new curriculum. Build political movement. It's possible, but difficult, and with prolonged effort. Option 2. Work within system. Keep children in school but counter-educate intensively at home. Challenge what's taught. Supplement with truth and knowledge. Stay engaged and push back where possible. Option 3. Exit the system. Homeschool or find alternative schools. Move to better zones. Build new schools. Create a parallel educational infrastructure outside of the captured system. Most parents will use some combination, but doing nothing is no longer viable once you understand what's being taught. Again, head over to McClelland Academy to see a range of professors, educators, and others working on various different projects. The stakes. This matters because education shapes the next generation. What Australian children learn in schools becomes what they believe about their country, culture, history, and themselves. If a generation is taught Australia is fundamentally racist and destructive, they'll govern that way. If taught objective truth doesn't exist, they can't think or govern rationally. If taught Western civilization is oppressive, they'll dismantle it. If taught to be activists before citizens, civic responsibility suffers. And if identity groups trump national identity, cohesion dissolves. Education is never just about learning. It shapes the future of the nation. Why it succeeded and what reversal requires. The 60-year capture succeeded because good people did nothing or were well outnumbered and too quickly. Academics in universities went unchallenged. Bureaucrats in curriculum authorities operated with impunity. Politicians of both parties failed to protect education. Media failed to scrutinise critically. Parents trusted too much and watched too little. It succeeded not because ideology was popular or advocates numerous, but because opposition was absent. If reversal is to happen, or if exodus to alternatives is to succeed, it requires good people doing something. Pay attention to what's actually taught. Read curriculum documents. Ask hard questions. Demand answers. Organise with other parents. Supplement education at home. Consider alternatives. Support organisations fighting for change. Vote for politicians who'll challenge the system. Build parallel institutions if necessary. The system won't reform itself. Captured institutions won't voluntarily release grip. Change comes only through organised, sustained, strategic parent action. Final thought. 60 years ago, Australian schools taught children to read, write, calculate, understand their country's history and culture, and take pride in being Australian. They did this imperfectly, sometimes harshly, with blind spots and flaws that should have been fixed. But they succeeded at the core mission, transmitting knowledge, morals, and culture. Today, Australian schools teach children to deconstruct knowledge, view their country primarily through a lens of its failures, identify primarily as members of identity groups, and become activists for progressive causes. They do this comprehensively, systematically, from kindergarten through year 12. The transformation was systematic, deliberate, and successful. Whether it will be reversed, or whether alternatives must be built outside the captured system, depends on what parents do next. The reversal, or the exodus, will succeed only if parents stay informed, stay organised, and stay committed to giving their children the education they deserve, one that builds knowledge, develops character, and prepares them for citizenship in a free society worth defending. Omission of information and access to certain information is also a form of mind control. Your children are depending on you. Australia's future is depending on you. It's time to act.